If you were to stand in an Amish kitchen for a single day and watch, you would notice something the modern kitchen has forgotten entirely, and it might unsettle you a little. Almost nothing is thrown away. The scraps of the meat become tomorrow's breakfast. The bones go into the broth pot. The apples, too bruised to keep, are dried or cooked down to butter. The bacon fat is saved in a crock by the stove. The trash can at the end of the day is very nearly empty. And I want you to understand, before you decide that this is just old-fashioned penny pinching, that it is not. Behind that empty trash can lies 300 years of hunger, of exile, of a people who crossed an ocean with nothing. And behind it lies a faith that calls the wasting of good food a kind of sin. Today I'm going to tell you the story of the Amish table, where it comes from, why we waste nothing, why we eat together the way we do, and what it all has to do with a people who were once refugees. Stay with me. It is not really a story about food at all. It is a story about memory and gratitude and holding a people together around a table. My name is Amos. I am Amish. I am past 65 years old, and I have eaten at a Lancaster County table my whole life, first at my mother's, now at my own. And in my mother's kitchen, waste was simply not done, not out of poverty in my time, for we had plenty, but because she had learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, back and back to people who had known real want. Nothing left a plate. Nothing edible went to the pigs that could feed a person first. And every meal, however plain, was received as a gift and eaten together, with a silent prayer before and after. Today I am going to take you back to where that table came from, across the ocean, and show you how a hunted, hungry people built a way of eating that was really a way of surviving, and then a way of worshiping, and how it endures on our tables to this day. But before any of that, I have to tell you who these people at the table really are, because the very name most folks call us by is a mistake. Stay with me. Let me clear up that name first, because it tells you something true. Most folks call us Pennsylvania Dutch, and they think it means we came from Holland, from the Netherlands. We did not. The word is a worn-down version of Deutsch, which is the German word for German, so Pennsylvania Dutch really means Pennsylvania German. Our people were German-speaking folk, and we still speak a dialect of German at home to this day. And where did these German-speaking people come from, and why did they leave? They came from the Rhineland, from the Palatinate, from Switzerland and Alsace, and a great many of them left because those lands had been ruined, wave after wave, by terrible wars of religion and by the persecution of plain, peaceable Anabaptist folk who would not fight. Whole regions had been burned and starved in those wars. So the people who eventually came to the Amish table were, many of them, the children and grandchildren of folk who had known famine, who had watched armies strip a countryside bare, who had learned in the hardest school, there is that food is life and waste is death. They carried that lesson across the ocean to William Penn's Pennsylvania in their very bones, and it shaped everything they cooked. Let me make that real for you, because it is easy to say war and famine and have the words slide right past. There was a war in the German lands, long before our people crossed over, that dragged on for 30 years and left the countryside a graveyard. Armies marched back and forth across those valleys year after year, and they took everything. The grain from the barns, the animals from the fields, the seed itself, so that even those the fighting spared were left to face the winter with empty cellars. Whole villages starved. People ate things I will not describe at a supper table. And that memory did not die with the ones who lived through it. It was handed down, the way such things are, in a deep and wordless caution that settled into how a family cooked and kept and ate. A people who have watched a full cellar mean the difference between living and dying through a winter do not ever again look at food as a small thing. They save the fat, they dry the apples, they keep the bones. They teach their children, without quite explaining why, that to waste good food is very nearly to spit on a grave. So when you see the carefulness of an old Amish kitchen, know that you are looking at the far end of a long memory of hunger, carried across an ocean and down 300 years. So what did that lesson build? It built a way of cooking that a food writer once described perfectly as abundance within constraint. That is to say, our old cooking is rich and hearty and generous, full of butter and cream and good meat, and yet, at the very same time, it wastes not one scrap, because both things came from the same hard wisdom: make the most of what the land gives you, and let nothing at all go to waste. And you can read that whole history right off an old Amish table in the dishes themselves. Consider scrapple, a humble loaf of pork scraps and cornmeal, born from the plain determination that when a hog was butchered, not one usable part of it would be wasted, so the bits that were left after the good cuts were cooked down with cornmeal into something that fed the family for weeks. Consider schnitz, which is simply apples sliced and dried in the autumn, so that the orchard's gift could feed you clear through a winter with no refrigeration. Consider the fruit butters, the apple butter and peach butter simmered down for hours in a great kettle, a way to keep the summer's fruit for the cold months. Consider the potato filling and the fried mush, dishes that stretched a little bread and a little cornmeal to fill many hungry stomachs in hard times. Every one of these dishes is a small monument to not wasting, invented by people who could not afford to. And the preserving, oh, the preserving, that was the heart of survival before there was such a thing as an electric icebox. And it still is on many an Amish farm today, for we keep no electric line to the house, so the harvest is put by, as the old folks said, against the winter. The root cellar, cool and dark, holds the potatoes and the carrots and the apples and the crocks. The canning jars are filled all summer and stacked on the cellar shelves, the beans and the tomatoes and the pickles and the meat. The herbs and the apple schnitz hang drying. The wood stove, the very heart of the kitchen, does the cooking and warms the room and heats the water all at once, wasting nothing there either. A well-stocked Amish cellar in November is a beautiful and a serious thing. It is a family security made visible, jar by jar, a whole winter's eating laid up by the work of a whole summer's hands. I remember my mother's cellar the way some men remember a cathedral. You went down the worn wooden steps into the cool and the dark, and there it all was, shelf after shelf, the glass jars catching what little light came down, red tomatoes and green beans and golden peaches and dark red beets, the crocks of pickles and of kraut, the bins of potatoes and carrots and apples in their sand, the hams and the dried things hanging from the beams. And my mother could stand at the top of those steps in the first cold of November and know, to a near certainty, that her family would eat well until spring, no matter what came, no matter the weather or the price of anything or whether the roads were open. There is a peace in that which I am not sure the modern world knows anymore, the peace of a family that has provided for itself and owes nothing and fears no lean month. That cellar was not hoarding, and it was not fear. It was the quiet confidence of people who had taken the summer's abundance and, with their own hands, turned it into a winter security. And every jar in it was a small act of love, put up by a mother thinking of her children in the cold months to come. Now, I want to take a moment, because this is the part that matters, because the table I am describing is not only about thrift and survival. It is, at its deepest, about community, about eating together, and that is the part the modern world has most completely lost. Understand that we have no church building. Instead, our congregation gathers to worship every other Sunday in one another's homes, taking turns, and after the long service, the host family and the women feed the entire church a meal right there, often a simple one, bread and cheese and pickles and pie, but everyone together at long tables. And a wedding is held in a home, with tables set up through the whole first floor of the house to feed hundreds. And when the fruit is ripe, families gather for what we call a frolic, a schnitzing to cut and dry the apples, or an apple butter boiling, and the work of preserving becomes a day of fellowship, many hands and much laughter around the kettle. And when a barn is raised or a harvest brought in, the women cook a great feast to feed the working men. Do you see it? On the Amish table, food is never merely fuel, and it is almost never eaten alone. It is the language we speak to say, "You are cared for, you belong, we are one people." To cook is to love your neighbor, and to eat together is to be the church. And I want you to picture one of these gatherings, because it will show you the thing better than any explaining. Imagine a barn raising, a family whose barn has burned, and the whole community come to build them a new one in a day. Out in the yard, the men are at the timbers, but step into the house and the kitchen, and there you will find the women, a dozen or more of them, working since before dawn, and the tables being set the length of the hole downstairs, and pot after pot, and pie after pie, coming out. Because those working men will need a great noon meal, and the women mean to give them one worthy of the day. And the children are underfoot and running errands and being handed the first warm cookies. And when the bell rings, and the men come in from the raising, grimy and tired and pleased, and everyone sits down together at those long tables, and a silence falls for the prayer, you understand, all at once, that the food and the fellowship and the faith and the work are not four separate things at all. They are one thing. The meal is the community made visible, the whole people gathered in one house, fed by many hands, giving thanks together. That is the Amish table at its truest, and there is no restaurant on earth that can serve it to you. And under all of it lies our faith, which shapes the table as surely as it shapes everything else. There is a word at the center of Amish life, Gelassenheit, which means something like humility, and yielding yourself and submitting to God's will over your own wants. And that spirit sits down at the table with us. It is why our food is plain and unpretentious rather than showy, for to make a great fuss and display of your eating would be a kind of pride, and pride we guard against. It is why we take our food in moderation and do not overindulge, for gluttony, too, is a worldly thing. It is why every meal, however humble, begins and ends with a silent prayer, because the food is received as a gift from God's hand and not as something we are merely owed. And it is why wasting that gift is felt, truly, as a small ingratitude, a turning up of the nose at what God has provided. So when that Amish trash can sits empty at the end of the day, it is not only thrift you are seeing. It is reverence. It is a people saying thank you with their hands, and there is a freedom in that spirit that the world does not expect. When you are not trying to impress anyone with your table, when a meal need not be a performance, only good and plain and grateful, then cooking stops being a burden and a competition and becomes again what it was meant to be, an act of care. The plainness is not a lack. It is a kind of rest. There is no shame at an Amish table in serving the same good soup you served last week. No anxiety over whether the dish is fashionable. No waste of a whole day and a fortune to lay on a show. There is only good food, honestly made, gratefully received, and shared. And I have come to think that is a richer way to eat than any amount of cleverness, and a great deal kinder to the woman who does the cooking. Now I have to be honest with you about a couple of things, so your picture is a true one and not a postcard. First, I will not pretend this thrift was always a gentle choice freely made, for much of it was forged in real poverty and real hunger, and there is nothing romantic about going without. That our ancestors turned want into an art and a discipline is to their great credit, but let us remember, it was want that taught them. Second, I must warn you about something you will meet if you go looking for Amish food out in the world. A great deal of what is sold to tourists as Amish cooking, the big buffets, the 7 sweets and 7 sours, and much of the rest, is what one honest food scholar called folklore, a tale invented for visitors, not the real plainer tradition of our homes. The Amish are in truth only a small part of the wider Pennsylvania German people, and the true old cooking is humbler and quieter than the show. They sell, So do not mistake the tourist table for ours. Ours is plainer, and it is not for sale. So here is what I would leave you with: the empty trash can, the full cellar, the long table, the silent prayer. These are not quaint habits left over from a poorer time. They are a whole way of seeing, handed down from people who knew hunger and exile, that food is a gift not to be wasted, that a family and a church are built and held together around a shared table, and that to feed one another well and gratefully is very near to the heart of a good life. The modern world has grown rich enough to waste half its food and to eat most of its meals alone and in a hurry, out of a package, and I do not say that to scold anyone, only to ask quietly whether that is truly the better bargain. There is something at the old Amish table worth remembering. Now tell me in the comments below. Tell me, what did your own family never waste? What did your grandmother save and stretch and make do with? The bacon grease in the can, the bones for the soup, the heel of the bread, because I will wager many of you come from people who knew this too, not so very long ago. And tell me, is there a dish that came down to you from the old people? One that was born of making do, that you make still? I would dearly love to hear it. Tell me your county too, and whether your family still gathers to eat. Next time, I am going to hand the story to my friend who keeps the property and the accounts, for he is going to tell you something that astonishes most folks, how these same people came to need no insurance company and no pension from the government at all, not out of pride, but because they built something older and stronger, and it begins with a burning barn. Until then, waste nothing, give thanks, gather at the table, and remember the people who fed their families and their whole community from their own kitchens with their own two hands knew things we are only just starting to remember.